Dr. Elias Carter had always been fascinated by the mysteries of space. A skilled archaeologist, he had traveled to the farthest corners of the galaxy, uncovering the lost stories of ancient civilizations. His latest mission, however, was different. This time, he was not searching through ruins on a distant planet. Instead, he and his team were boarding a ship, an enormous vessel that had been drifting through space for thousands of years, forgotten by time. The ship was discovered by accident. A small probe, sent to investigate a dying star, had detected unusual readings. When a fleet of researchers followed, they found the massive craft, abandoned and silent, floating in the dark reaches of space. No one knew who built it or why it was here. The ship was enormous, its metal hull darkened by age and space dust, and its design was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Elias stood on the bridge of their own ship, gazing at the derelict vessel through a large viewport. The ship looked like a shadow against the cold, starry background. It had been abandoned for so long that its once shiny surface was now rusted and dull. But something about it intrigued Elias. It wasn't just the ship's size that amazed him, but the fact that it seemed alive. There was something strange in the way it drifted, as if it was waiting for something or someone. The team prepared to board the derelict ship, their hearts racing with excitement. They had no idea what they might find inside. Would it be a treasure trove of knowledge, or a dangerous relic of a long-dead civilization? Elias and his crew were about to step into the unknown. As they entered the ship, the interior felt cold and empty, as though it had been abandoned for centuries. The walls were lined with strange symbols that Elias could not recognize, their glowing edges flickering dimly. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of age and neglect. The ship's corridors were narrow and winding, with doors that creaked open on their own, as if the ship itself was trying to communicate something. "This is incredible," Elias muttered, running his fingers along the wall. The material felt warm, as if it still had some kind of pulse, but there was no sound except for the echo of their footsteps. The team split up to explore different sections of the ship. Elias walked down a long hallway, his flashlight illuminating the dark corners. As he moved deeper into the ship, he noticed something odd. The walls seemed to change. The symbols that once glowed with a pale blue light began to shift, moving like they were alive, reacting to his presence. It felt as though the ship was watching him, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. Elias felt a thrill of excitement run through him. This was what he lived for, discovering the unknown, unlocking the mysteries of ancient civilizations. But as he rounded a corner, he came across something that made his heart stop. There, in a large chamber, stood a massive door. Unlike the other doors on the ship, this one was made of an ornate black material that shimmered faintly in the dark. Intricate designs were carved into its surface, depicting strange, otherworldly creatures and symbols. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The door seemed to hum with a strange energy, as if it was calling to him. Elias approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. He had a feeling that whatever lay beyond this door would change everything. He placed his hand on the cold surface of the door, and the moment he did, the symbols began to glow brightly. The ship seemed to come alive, and the door slowly creaked open, revealing a large room beyond. Inside, Elias could hardly believe what he was seeing. In the center of the room, resting in a giant, spherical chamber, was a cryopod. Its glass surface cracked in places, as if it had been abandoned in haste. But what was even more shocking was the figure inside. The figure was humanoid, but unlike any human he had ever seen. The person inside was tall, with smooth, pale skin that shimmered like marble. Their hair, long and silver, cascaded around their shoulders, and their eyes, though closed, appeared to be a deep crimson color. They were dressed in an elegant alien garment, adorned with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the light. The figure looked so lifelike, as if they were simply sleeping. Elias stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe his eyes. Who was this being? And why were they trapped in this strange pod? It was clear that they weren't human, but their beauty and grace were undeniable. He had to know more. As Elias examined the pod, he noticed that the control panel beside it was flickering with a weak red light. He could see faint markings that indicated the pod systems were still functional, though barely. With a sense of determination, he carefully studied the panel, trying to figure out how to open the pod. His fingers hovered over the controls, unsure of what would happen next. But his curiosity was too great. He had to learn the truth. Taking a deep breath, Elias pressed a series of buttons. The pod hissed and shuddered as it came to life. Slowly, the glass began to retract, revealing the figure inside. The air around him seemed to crackle with energy. The ship's lights flickered as the pod opened fully, and the figure's eyes slowly fluttered open. Crimson eyes met his with a sudden intensity, and Elias froze. The air around them felt electric, charged with a strange power. The being inside the pod sat up, their movements fluid and graceful. And in that moment, Elias realized that he had just awakened something ancient, something powerful. The adventure was only just beginning. The room was still. The only sound was the quiet hum of the ship's systems, but to Dr. Elias Carter, it felt like the very air was holding its breath. He stood there, frozen in place, staring at the being now sitting in front of him. The figure's crimson eyes were locked onto his, and in that instant, everything around him seemed to fade away. The ship, the mission, his team. They all seemed unimportant compared to this strange, beautiful creature. The figure blinked slowly, its silver hair flowing like a river of light around its face. Then, in a voice that sounded both distant and near, it spoke. "You woke me." The words were soft, like a whisper, but they carried an undeniable authority. The voice had a melodic quality to it, as though each word was sung with a kind of ancient power. Elias swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. His heart was racing. He had never expected this. The figure before him was not just an alien. It was something far more ancient and mysterious. This wasn't some lost civilization or forgotten artifact. It was a living being. I didn't mean to disturb you," Elias stammered, his mind struggling to process the sight before him. Who are you?" The being tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. For a moment, it seemed almost amused, though there was no smile, just a hint of something more ancient and knowing behind its eyes. "I am Vampiress," it said, its voice low but steady, "sovereign of the Nyxari." The words hung in the air, strange and unfamiliar to Elias. The Nyxari. He had never heard of such a species, and yet something about the name felt important. He could sense that this being was not from a simple, distant world. No, it was far older, far more powerful than anything he had ever encountered. You're from a different time," Elias asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "How long have you been here?" Vampiress's eyes flashed with something unreadable, a brief flicker of emotion that Elias couldn't quite place. "Time is a fragile thing," she said slowly. "I have slept for millennia, trapped within this vessel. The stars have shifted, civilizations have risen and fallen, and yet I remained, until you awoke me." Elias took a step forward, his mind racing with questions. This was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He had uncovered artifacts from ancient species, yes, but never a living being, and certainly not one who seemed so calm, so composed despite the strangeness of her situation. "What happened to your people?" he asked, his voice tinged with wonder and concern. "Why are you the only one left?" Vampiress's gaze grew distant, as if the memories were difficult to reach. She stood slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. "My people," she began, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the room, "were not conquerors. We were guardians, protectors of balance in the universe. We absorbed the energy of stars, not to rule, but to sustain. Our purpose was to watch over the flow of life, to ensure that nothing would disturb the natural order. Elias listened intently, fascinated by the depth of her words. This wasn't a story of war or conquest. It was a story of guardianship, of a species that had sought to protect rather than dominate. But, he prompted gently, sensing there was more to the story. Verasthal's eyes darkened, her expression hardening. But we were betrayed. A faction within our own people, corrupted by greed and hunger for power, turned against us. They sought to use our power for their own gain. We fought, but in the end, it was too much. I was placed in stasis, and my ship was abandoned. The rest of my people were lost. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The sorrow in her voice was palpable, and yet, despite the pain she carried, there was a strength in her that seemed almost untouchable. This was no ordinary being. This was a sovereign, a queen whose people had fallen, and yet she had endured. "I'm sorry," Elias said quietly, his respect for her growing with each word she spoke. Verasthal gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "There is no need for pity. I have long since come to terms with it. The universe is vast, and there are always new forces that arise to shape the future. Perhaps it is time for me to find my place in this new world." Elias couldn't help but wonder what that meant. What would she do now? She had been asleep for so long, and the galaxy had changed in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. Would she be able to adapt? Or was she a relic of the past, doomed to be lost again in this strange new age? Before he could ask, a soft beep sounded from the control panel beside him. He turned quickly, glancing at the screen. Something was wrong. The ship's energy readings were spiking, rapidly. "What's happening?" Elias muttered, his eyes narrowing as he read the data. It didn't make sense. The ship's systems were coming online, but this wasn't just a power surge. It was something far more dangerous. Verasthal moved toward him in an instant, her eyes flashing with renewed intensity. "Something is coming," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "Something ancient. It is not the ship you should fear. It is what lies within." Elias felt his pulse quicken as the ship began to groan, its walls shifting and creaking. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. Verasthal reached out, placing a hand on the console. Her fingers glowed with an eerie light, and the ship seemed to settle, but the tension in the air was thick. "What is it?" Elias asked, his voice tight with concern. "A force," she replied, her tone grave. "A devourer, a creature that feeds on stars. It has awoken." Elias felt his stomach drop. This was no ordinary ship. It was a prison, holding something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "We must leave," Verasthal said urgently. "Now." Elias nodded, turning to call his team. They had only just begun to uncover the secrets of this vessel, and already they were facing something far beyond their understanding. The ship's walls trembled as the unsettling hum grew louder. Elias could feel the cold, metallic vibrations through his boots, and the air around him seemed to grow heavier. The overhead lights flickered as if they, too, were struggling to stay on. He turned to look at Verasthal, who was now standing tall, her gaze fixed on the console as her fingers glowed faintly with an eerie light. Her eyes, crimson and full of depth, seemed to see something far beyond the ship's walls, far beyond the present moment. "What is it?" Elias asked again, his voice trembling slightly. "What exactly is coming?" Verasthal didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied the console with intensity, her brow furrowing as she seemed to tap into the ship's systems, her alien presence almost merging with the vessel itself. The ship's eye, which had been eerily silent up until now, suddenly spoke. "Warning. Unknown entity detected. Class. Devourer class anomaly. Energy readings exceeding normal parameters." The words sent a cold chill through Elias's spine. His training had taught him about many types of dangers, but this was something far beyond his comprehension. He glanced at Verasthal, his voice shaky. "A devourer. What does that mean?" Varasdal's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer to the console, her hand now hovering over the control panel. The Devourers are ancient cosmic entities. They feed on the energy of stars, consuming them until nothing remains. Whole civilizations have been destroyed by them, entire systems wiped from existence. Elias felt his breath catch in his throat. The thought of a being that could consume entire stars was unfathomable. Why is it here? How is it awake? She closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to something only she could hear. Her voice was soft, but heavy with ancient sorrow as she spoke. My people, the Nixari, once guarded the balance of the stars. We were keepers of energy, preventers of chaos. The Devourers were sealed away, locked within this ship for millennia. They were placed in stasis to prevent them from ravaging the galaxy. But something went wrong. Her gaze met his then, and in her eyes, Elias saw a history older than he could fathom. The weight of her words pressed down on him like a heavy stone. I was meant to remain in slumber until the ship returned to safety, Varasdal continued, but by awakening me, you have also disturbed the lock. The Devourer is free, and the ship, this vessel, is its prison. Elias took a step back, his mind racing. He had no idea how to handle such a revelation. But if this ship is its prison, why is it still alive? Why hasn't it been destroyed by the Devourer? Varasdal paused, her expression unreadable. Because my people placed themselves between the Devourer and the rest of the galaxy. They sacrificed everything to keep the anomaly contained. The ship was a prison and a shield, and they kept it running at all costs. But their energy ran out. Their power faded, and the ship became a tomb. The Devourer waited. The silence between them grew thick with understanding. Elias realized with a sinking feeling that they were in far deeper trouble than he had ever imagined. The ship wasn't just an ancient relic. It was a prison. And the being they had just awakened wasn't some forgotten queen. It was the last of the Nixari, and the galaxy's only hope against an unimaginable threat. We need to leave, Elias said urgently. If this ship is no longer capable of holding the Devourer, we need to get out of here now. Varasdal's gaze softened slightly, but her tone remained steady. It is not that simple. The Devourer is awakening, but it has not yet fully regained its strength. We still have time, but not much. Elias looked at the walls of the ship, now humming with an unsettling power. He could feel the energy shifting, as if the ship itself was reacting to the danger. How much time do we have? Minutes, Varasdal replied, her voice colder now, with the urgency of someone who had seen too many worlds burn. A sudden, loud alarm blared throughout the ship, cutting off any further conversation. Elias jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights flickered wildly, and a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the corridors. The ship seemed to be coming to life, the dormant systems awakening with frightening speed. This is it, Varasdal said, her voice sharp and focused. We must move. Now. Without waiting for Elias to respond, she turned and began walking down the hallway. Her movements were swift, and her expression was set with determination. Elias followed closely behind, his mind racing with a dozen questions and no answers. He could hear the ship's walls groaning under pressure, and the feeling of impending doom hung in the air like a thick fog. They reached the central command room, where the rest of the team was waiting. Elias quickly explained the situation, but there was no time for further discussion. The ship's alarms grew louder, and the walls shook harder. The Devourer was close. We need to activate the escape pods, Elias ordered, trying to stay calm. Now. One of his team members, a young engineer named Sarah, rushed to the control panel and began working quickly, her hands flying over the keys. But as she worked, the console flickered wildly, and a series of red warning lights flashed across the room. The pods aren't responding. Sarah called out in panic. The system is down. Varasdal stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural light. She placed her hand on the control panel, and the lights flickered once more. A low hum filled the air, and the room seemed to shudder as if the very heart of the ship was waking. "Stand back," she commanded. Elias and the others stepped aside as Vampiress focused her energy. The ship's systems groaned, but then the lights stabilized, and the escape pods activated with a soft hiss. One by one, they began to open, but the sound of an even louder rumble filled the ship. It was coming. The devourer was almost free. "Go," Vampiress urged. "Hurry." Elias didn't hesitate. With his team following close behind, they rushed to the nearest escape pods. As they entered and the doors sealed shut, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were running away from something much larger than they could ever understand. But for now, survival was all that mattered. The escape pods detached from the ship, shooting into space, but Elias's mind was still with the ancient being they had just awakened, the last of the Nixari. She had warned them, but now, the real fight was just beginning. The escape pods shot through the empty blackness of space, their engines roaring as they sped away from the derelict ship. Inside, Elias sat frozen, staring at the small viewport, his mind racing. The ship behind them was growing smaller, but the danger still lingered. Even now, as they drifted further into the silence of space, the threat of the devourer seemed to press in on them from all sides. The pod's cabin was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the control panel. Elias could hear the quiet hum of the pod systems, but his thoughts were far away. He couldn't stop thinking about what Vampiress had said. The devourer was a force of destruction, ancient and powerful. What could they possibly do to stop something that could feed on stars? "Elias, you all right?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She was sitting across from him, her face pale and tense. The rest of the team was scattered throughout the pod, each person in their own thoughts. Elias turned to face her, trying to focus. "I don't know, Sarah. This is bigger than anything we've ever dealt with. I spent my whole life studying ancient civilizations and artifacts, but this is something else." "I know," Sarah said, her voice quiet but steady. "The devourer sounds like something from a nightmare. But we survived. We're alive." The words helped, but they didn't ease the heavy weight in Elias's chest. Being alive didn't mean they were safe. The real danger was still out there, somewhere, in the vast emptiness of space. "Where are we heading?" Elias asked, shifting his gaze to the controls. They had to go somewhere, but the unknown stretches of space seemed endless. "Closest inhabited system," Sarah replied, her fingers moving over the controls. "We need to get in touch with the fleet. They'll know what to do." Elias nodded but didn't feel reassured. The fleet might be their only hope, but how could they fight something so ancient, something that had been sealed away for millennia? As he sat in the quiet of the pod, a thought crossed his mind. Vampiress, the last of the Nixari. She had been their guide through the derelict ship, but now, separated from them, she was a mystery. What had she meant when she said, "The devourer is not just a creature, it is a force, an imbalance that disrupts the flow of life itself"? What could that possibly mean? And how could they stop it? Suddenly, the pod shuddered, throwing Elias against the padded seat. The sudden movement startled everyone inside, and the pod's lights flickered as a warning light flashed on the control panel. "What was that?" Elias asked, his heart racing as he grabbed the edges of his seat to steady himself. "Something's pulling us," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We're being pulled toward something, some kind of gravitational force." Before Elias could respond, the pod began to accelerate, drawn by an unseen force. The small window showed nothing but the emptiness of space, but they were moving faster, faster than they should be, as if the pod itself had lost control. "No," Sarah shouted, trying to regain control of the pod. Her fingers flew across the console, but the controls seemed unresponsive. The ship was being dragged in a direction none of them had chosen. "It's the devourer," Elias muttered, his heart sinking. "It's following us." A deep, rumbling sound echoed from outside the pod, like the growl of some ancient beast. The entire pod seemed to shake, as if something massive was closing in on them. "What is that noise?" one of the team members asked, voice filled with dread. "I don't know, but it's not good," Elias replied, his eyes wide with fear. He glanced out the viewport, and his stomach twisted. There in the distance, a massive shadow seemed to loom, a dark and twisting shape moving through space. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. A swirling mass of energy, pulsing and undulating like something alive. "There it is," Varazthal's voice suddenly echoed in his mind, clear and strong despite the distance. "The Devourer. It is a living force, a cosmic anomaly that feeds not just on stars, but on everything around it. The ship you have just left. It was more than just a prison. It was a warning." Elias's blood ran cold. He had heard her words, but now, in the face of this thing, they took on a new meaning. The Devourer was not a creature in the traditional sense. It was a force of nature, a force that could not be fought with weapons or technology. He gripped the edge of his seat, struggling to remain calm as the pod continued to speed toward the dark mass ahead of them. "We have to stop this," he muttered, though part of him didn't believe they could. "There's got to be a way. I'm doing everything I can," Sarah said desperately, her hands moving over the controls, but it was clear that nothing was working. The gravitational pull was too strong. The pod was being dragged closer and closer to the dark energy that stretched out in all directions. Elias closed his eyes, trying to think. They had learned so little about the Devourer, but what they had learned painted a terrifying picture. This creature, this force, was not something that could be simply destroyed. It was ancient, beyond comprehension. And yet, Varazthal had mentioned one thing that stuck with him. The Nixari were not just protectors, they were also the keepers of energy. There had to be a connection. The Nixari had sealed the Devourer away for a reason, and Varazthal, the last of her kind, had the knowledge they needed. She had to know something, some way to stop this nightmare from consuming them. The pod continued to pull closer. Elias looked out the viewport once more, and he could see it now. An enormous swirling mass of energy, a vortex of darkness with faint, distant flashes of light within it, like stars being devoured. It was a living black hole, a cosmic predator. He felt a sense of helplessness settle over him. No matter how hard he tried to come up with a solution, it seemed as though they were simply too small in the face of something so vast. But then, as if answering his unspoken thought, the pod's console blinked with a sudden message. Transmission received. Elias's heart leaped. He hurried to the console, his hands shaking. The message was brief but clear. "This is Varazthal. Follow my signal. It is the only way." The voice, though distant, was filled with urgency. "Varazthal," Elias whispered, his voice filled with hope. "She's still out there." The pod continued its path, but now Elias had something to hold on to, the hope that there was a way to stop the Devourer. They had to trust Varazthal. She had warned them, and she was offering them a way out. "Hold on," Elias said, turning to his team. "We're not giving up yet." The escape pod jolted once more, throwing Elias forward. He gripped the console, his knuckles turning white. The gravitational force pulling them toward the Devourer seemed to intensify, the dark mass ahead growing larger and more terrifying with each passing second. "Sarah, what's happening?" Elias shouted, his voice rising in urgency. "I can't stop it," Sarah replied, her face pale with panic. "The pod systems are failing. We're being dragged in too quickly." The hum of the pod's engines was no longer steady, but erratic. The quiet, almost peaceful hum from earlier had turned into a distorted sound, like a distant growl. Elias could hear the tension in Sarah's voice as she worked feverishly to regain control, her fingers flying over the controls in a desperate attempt to pull them away. The crew looked out of the windows in silence, eyes wide with fear. The Devourer was closer now, a swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to suck the very light from the stars around it. It pulsed like a heart, a living entity that could feel the pull of their small craft. Elias couldn't deny it any longer. They were running out of time. He glanced back at the console, and that's when he saw it, a small flashing light. Transmission received. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was it Vera's fall? Elias rushed to the console, ignoring the chaos around him. He pressed a button to open the transmission, and her voice filled the pod. It was faint but steady, a beacon of hope amidst the growing despair. "This is Vera's Thal," she began, her voice calm but urgent. "I know you are being pulled toward the Devourer. Do not panic. I will guide you through it. But you must trust me." Elias's heart pounded. "Vera's Thal," he said, almost relieved to hear her voice. "Where are you? We need your help." There was a brief pause before her voice continued, her tone resolute. "I am far from you, but my energy is still connected to the ship. I will send a signal to help you. Follow it, and do not deviate. The Devourer is not just a predator. It is the embodiment of imbalance. If you enter its reach, you will be lost. But I can show you the path to safety." Elias turned to Sarah. "We have to follow the signal," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Sarah nodded quickly, though her face remained tight with fear. She turned back to the console, her hand steady now, as she entered the new coordinates Vera's Thal had sent. For a moment, nothing happened. The pod remained on its collision course with the Devourer. Elias felt his stomach churn with fear. Was it too late? Then, slowly, the pod began to shift, the gravitational force no longer pulling them toward the Devourer, but guiding them away, as if invisible hands were steering them. "We're moving," Sarah said, her voice full of disbelief. The crew exchanged looks, some of them still unsure of what was happening. But the pod was no longer being dragged toward the dark mass. Instead, it felt as though they were gliding through space, following an unseen path, away from the clutches of the Devourer. Elias didn't know how Vera's Thal was doing it, but he couldn't waste this opportunity. They had to keep moving, keep following her signal. "We're not safe yet," Elias said, standing up and moving toward the windows again. He could see the Devourer now, more clearly than ever. It was a twisting, writhing mass, a black hole of endless hunger. The stars around it were bending and warping as if they were being drawn into its gravity, disappearing one by one. "There has to be a way to stop it," Elias muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Vera's Thal's voice came through the speakers once more, steady and calming. "The Devourer is not a creature that can be destroyed with conventional weapons. It feeds on energy, but it is not just a predator. It is an imbalance in the universe. It has existed for eons, feeding on stars, on civilizations, on entire galaxies. It cannot be reasoned with." Elias clenched his fists. "Then what can we do? How do we stop it?" "By understanding it," Vera's Thal replied. "The Devourer exists because of the imbalance it represents. For millennia, my people, the Nixari, maintained the balance of energy in the galaxy. We were the protectors, the keepers. When the Devourer was sealed away, we thought it was finished, but its presence still echoes through the fabric of reality. It cannot be destroyed, only contained." "Contained?" Elias asked, his voice filled with confusion. "How do we contain something like that?" "The answer lies in the energy field surrounding the Devourer," Vera's Thal continued. "It is the key to stopping it. But the field is unstable. It must be stabilized before it can be sealed away again. To do this, you will need the device I have left behind. It is located within the center of the ship you escaped from. Only with it can you create a shield powerful enough to neutralize the Devourer's energy." Elias felt a surge of hope. There was still a way. It was risky, but it was their only chance. "We'll need to go back to the ship," Elias said, his voice firm. "We can't outrun it forever." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with fear and doubt. "But we're being pulled toward it. How can we go back?" Varazthal is guiding us, Elias replied. She'll help us. The pod continued to glide through space, following Varazthal's instructions. The team remained silent, each person lost in their thoughts, but there was a new sense of determination in the air. They had come so far, survived so much. Now, the real challenge awaited. Elias stared at the swirling mass of the devourer ahead, his resolve hardening. They had to find a way to stop it. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about saving everything. The escape pod continued its silent journey through the cold emptiness of space, guided by Varazthal's signal. Elias stared out the viewport, watching the swirling mass of the devourer grow larger with each passing moment. The dark energy at its core seemed to pulse, as though it could sense their approach, hungry and relentless. It was a force unlike anything he had ever encountered, a cosmic predator that didn't just consume stars, but threatened the very fabric of reality itself. "We're getting close," Sarah said quietly, her voice tense. "If we don't do something soon, it'll be too late." Elias nodded. He could feel the pressure mounting. Every second felt like a countdown to disaster. Varazthal had said they needed to return to the derelict ship, the one they had just escaped from, if they had any hope of stopping the devourer. The ship was their only chance, and the device she had spoken of, hidden within its heart, was their last hope. But how could they get back in time? The pod was still being pulled toward the dark mass of the devourer, despite their efforts to navigate away from it. Elias turned to Sarah, who was concentrating on the controls. She was determined, but Elias could see the fear in her eyes. They all felt it, the weight of what they were up against. The devourer wasn't just a threat to them. It was a threat to the entire galaxy. "Can we go faster?" Elias asked. "I'm pushing the engines as hard as I can," Sarah replied. "The gravitational pull is too strong. We're being dragged in slowly, but there's no way to escape it completely unless we can stabilize the energy field around the ship." A chill ran down Elias's spine at her words. Varazthal had said they needed to create a shield powerful enough to neutralize the devourer's energy, but it wasn't going to be easy. The device she mentioned, the one inside the derelict ship, was their only hope. He glanced over at the rest of the crew, who were all silently watching him. Everyone was aware of the stakes now. The weight of their situation hung over them like a dark cloud. "We'll make it," Elias said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He had to believe it. For their sake. For the galaxy. The pod suddenly shook again, harder than before. Elias gripped the console, his eyes snapping to the control panel. What was that? Sarah's face paled. "It's the devourer," she said. "It's reaching out with its energy. We need to move quickly." The pod's systems flickered, and a deep, rumbling sound filled the cabin. The space around them seemed to distort, the fabric of reality warping like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. Elias could feel it in his chest, a strange pressure, as though the air itself was being crushed under the weight of the devourer's power. "We're losing power," Sarah said, her voice tight. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Elias's heart pounded. "We have to keep going. We don't have a choice." He turned to the window again, watching as the dark mass of the devourer loomed ahead, now only a few hours away. The force surrounding it was so immense, so all-consuming, that it felt like the very stars were being devoured. He could see faint glimmers of light disappearing into the center of the vortex, as if being swallowed by the black hole at the heart of it. But there was still hope. Varazthal had told them to follow the signal, and he wasn't about to give up now. A sudden burst of static crackled through the pod's comm system, and Varazthal's voice echoed once more, clearer this time. "Elias, Sarah, listen to me," Varazthal said, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "You are getting close. The device I left behind in the ship is in the central chamber. It is powered by the energy of the Nixari. It is the only thing that can create a shield strong enough to stop the devourer's pull. But you must reach it before the devourer completely overwhelms you." You must hurry. Elias's mind raced. The device was their only hope, but how could they reach it before the Devourer's energy destroyed everything in its path? Varaz fall. We're being pulled in too fast. How can we get to the ship in time? Elias asked, his voice desperate. You must trust in the energy of the Nixari, Varaz fall replied. It is an ancient power, one that flows through the universe. You must focus. The ship is alive, and it will guide you. Reach out to it. Trust in the energy that connects all things. Elias felt a surge of something deep within him, a strange pull that seemed to come from beyond his own thoughts. He closed his eyes for a moment, reaching out in his mind. The pod systems felt different, as though they were more than just machines. They felt alive. We need to focus, Elias said, opening his eyes. Sarah, trust me. If we want to survive, we need to follow Varazthal's instructions. The ship isn't just a piece of metal. It's more than that. We can feel it. Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with doubt. How are we supposed to feel a ship? I don't know, but I think it's the only way. We have to reach the core of the ship. The device is there. It can protect us. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Sarah nodded slowly, though she didn't look completely convinced. But there was no time for doubt. They had to act now. The pod shook again, harder this time. The pressure inside was growing unbearable, the energy of the devourer pushing them closer to its heart. But Elias could feel it now, the strange connection Varaz fall had spoken of. He reached out, letting the energy of the ship flow through him. Focus, he whispered. We can do this. And just like that, the pod began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, as though the very ship itself was guiding them. They were no longer being pulled toward the devourer. Instead, they were being drawn back, toward the derelict ship that still held the key to their survival. We're going back, Elias said, a sense of awe in his voice. We're going to make it. The escape pod continued its rapid approach toward the derelict ship. The dark, swirling mass of the devourer loomed behind them, its gravity pulling at the very fabric of space. But Elias felt something had shifted. They were no longer drifting helplessly toward certain doom. The ship, guided by Varazthal's ancient energy, had become an extension of their will. We're almost there, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with determination. Her fingers flew over the controls, steady despite the chaos outside. The ship's hull groaned, as if protesting the intense forces pulling at it, but they were getting closer to their goal. Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The devourer was not just a cosmic force. It was the very embodiment of imbalance, consuming everything in its path. Yet they were still alive, still fighting. And now they had a chance, a fleeting chance, to stop it. The ship grew larger in the pod's viewport, its once barren exterior now seeming almost alive, as if it were welcoming them back. The twisted, broken metal and debris that had once made it feel like an abandoned graveyard now seemed like the last fortress of hope. Varazthal, Elias said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. We're coming in. The pod is holding together. I know, came Varazthal's calm voice through the comms, but you must act quickly. The device is in the central chamber. It is the heart of the ship now. Once you have activated it, you will need to focus all your energy on maintaining the shield. Do not let go. Elias nodded, though he knew Varazthal could not see him. Understood. We won't fail. The escape pod docked with a soft thud against the derelict ship's docking port. For a moment, everything was still. They were inside, but the threat of the devourer was never far behind. Elias didn't waste time. He stood and motioned for the others to follow. Let's go, he said, his voice firm. The crew members stood, some still looking uneasy but determined to help. They knew the gravity of the situation. Together, they moved quickly through the narrow corridors of the derelict ship, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Elias led the way, his heart pounding with each step. The ship felt alive in a strange way. its walls humming with energy. The air was thick with the scent of old metal and forgotten machinery. It was as though the ship had been waiting for them, waiting for this moment to arrive. "We're almost there," Elias said as they turned a corner and entered the central chamber. It was a vast room, larger than anything they had encountered aboard the ship. In the center stood a massive structure, a device unlike any technology Elias had ever seen. It was pulsing with energy, its surface glowing faintly with a light that seemed to shift with every passing moment. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice reverberating with awe. "This is the device Vampiress spoke of." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the device. It looked like a fusion of organic and mechanical components, with intricate patterns carved into its surface. There were no buttons, no levers, only a deep, resonating hum that filled the room. "How do we activate it?" one of the crew members asked. "We don't need to know the details," Elias said. "We just have to trust it." He approached the device cautiously, his hand outstretched. The moment his fingers touched its surface, the room seemed to come alive. A surge of energy shot through him, and for a brief moment, he felt as though his entire body was filled with light. It was a sensation of pure power, a connection to something ancient and beyond comprehension. The device began to hum louder, its light intensifying. A massive wave of energy shot out from it, surrounding the room in a protective aura. Elias stepped back, eyes wide as the device continued to pulse with energy. "We have to focus," Elias said, struggling to maintain his composure. "The shield is forming. We have to keep it stable." Sarah and the crew gathered around him, all of them feeling the intense surge of energy. Elias could see the strain on their faces as they tried to focus, their hands pressed against the device as if they, too, could channel its power. The energy surrounding them grew stronger, vibrating with the power of the Nixari. It was like nothing they had ever felt before, a raw, primal force that connected them to the universe itself. Elias focused all his thoughts, all his energy, on keeping the shield stable. Outside, the devourer was closing in. The dark mass grew larger by the second, its pull growing stronger. But the shield held steady, a barrier of light and energy between them and the cosmic force that threatened to consume them. "We're holding it back," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "It's working." Elias's heart raced. They had done it. They had activated the device, and it was protecting them. But the devourer was relentless. It would not give up easily. "We need to keep this up," Elias said, his voice filled with urgency. "If we let go, it will all fall apart." The crew nodded, each of them struggling to maintain their focus. The devourer's energy was powerful, but the shield was stronger. It flickered and pulsed with the rhythm of the universe, pushing against the darkness, holding it back. Elias felt the strain on his body, but he pushed through it. They couldn't afford to fail now. The galaxy depended on them. Time seemed to stretch on. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the devourer began to retreat. Its energy faltered, weakened by the power of the Nixari device. The once pulsing black mass began to shrink, slowly but surely, until it was no more than a faint speck in the distance. "We did it," Sarah whispered, a note of disbelief in her voice. "It's gone." Elias breathed a sigh of relief, though his body was still trembling from the effort. They had done it. They had saved the galaxy from the devourer's destruction. But even as the devourer faded into nothingness, Elias knew their journey was far from over. There were still mysteries to uncover, still dangers lurking in the vast reaches of space. But for now, they had won. And that was enough.